Hi, good evening, everybody. It's so good to be with all of you, and welcome, Dr. Frans Cronje, for our episode number 2 on this outlook on South Africa. And thank you so much for joining me and our community this evening.
Chief Rabbi, good evening to you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
And I think the purpose of this evening, as we discussed a few months, and hopefully every few months we'll get together again to look at the issues of South Africa and to look at them from a rational point of view. So often when we're looking at these political and social economic issues, there's a lot of emotion in it. And I think these episodes and this series it's not about optimism or pessimism. It is simply about rational analysis and looking about what's going on. And in a certain sense, Frans, my role here is really to ask the questions I'm hearing from our community, because there's a lot of concerns out there. And I think tonight we want to look at really 4 issues tonight. One is, of course, the ongoing electricity, the power crisis in our country. Number 2 is NHI and the concerns around that. And then, of course, the South African government's relationship with Russia and the fallout from that, from an economic and a global political point of view. And then finally, to start looking at the general elections, which are going to take place next year, and some of the political trends towards that. So those, from what I've heard, speaking to people and hearing what's going on in the community, those are the issues which are top of mind. And let's dive right in and look at this question of the electricity crisis and the power crisis. Where are we holding on this at the moment? There's been a bit of respite lately. What's the context here, and maybe what's the prognosis, and in a certain sense the diagnosis of the problem. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's looking a bit better, and for the past, let's say, 3 weeks or so, South Africa's been averaging load shedding within stage 2. If you average it over 24 hours. We've had days without, and we've had sort of level 3 load shedding in the evenings. And I think that's caught a lot of observers by surprise, because when we met, I think it was in March, and had the first of these conversations, the climate of opinion, popular media opinion, was still warning of a national blackout, and that stage 8 load shedding was upon us, and that catastrophe would befall us. And in that briefing, that chat, the first of this forum, we made the point to you that wasn't assured at all. And on the contrary, it was our expectation that the extent of load shedding could be considerably reduced over the year ahead. And I think we were largely alone in making that call. And the reason we were able to do so is that through February, we had done a vast amount of work on the question of load shedding government policy. And when I say
Frans,
we...
I'm sorry to interrupt. Yes, I was about to say the we.
Yeah. When I say we, I speak to you as the chairman of a public policy group called the Social Research Foundation. Was established in South Africa about 2 years ago. It's a small but extremely well-resourced operation. And its initial purpose, still its chief purpose, is to provide very high quality information on the country to people who will make decisions that will be instrumental in determining the country's future. So Social Research Foundation reports are sent to, for example, the leaders of all the country's political parties, senior leaders in business, the editors of major publications, and the diplomats that represent South Africa's trade partners around the world. And a lot of that initially, as you know, the great focus, we're going to get into that this evening again, is the election next year and what happens. I've done a lot of political polling work, which hasn't been done by anyone else, and can actually get a fact-based kind of grounding to the political discussion. And in all the heat and angst of load shedding, we did a similar exercise on Eskom, proper deep dive, hard research project that sought to understand what generating capacity is available to the country, What is the grid capacity looking like? What are the various energy options South Africa could entertain to get out of load shedding? How have those been applied in the rest of the world? We spoke to experts all over the place. We spoke to insiders within Eskom, often on ground of anonymity. And the further we went into that work, the more, and it extended past our chat in March. We, in fact, only published our final recommendations a few weeks ago. And what began to astonish me in drafting it, and a colleague who worked closely on it, is the more we did of this, the more we couldn't understand why there was load shedding at all. Because we encountered very early on that South Africa has vast quantities of generating capacity, power stations, a significant proportion of which were lying idle. And many of those sat in the country's coal fleet. And in total, South Africa has a coal fleet that could produce, and in theory, at nameplate capacity, 45,000 megawatts of electricity. But in fact, in February, when we did our baseline data, of that 45 was producing only 17. And we looked closely into what government was doing on energy policy, and it was pursuing very strongly and with some merit policy of decommissioning coal, letting the coal fleet run down, and seeking to replace the lost capacity with wind power and solar power in the main, both of which have their merits when used in the right manner. But it also quickly became apparent to us that this was a futile exercise. And that at this point in time, our later recommendations were different. South Africa could not use wind and solar power to fill the demand gap that was necessary first to end load shedding. And then again, this is, once you get past load shedding, there's a new priority, which is to generate enough electricity to again enable a high level of economic growth, so we can get out of the unemployment, inequality, and poverty problems that are such a risk to our future. And one of the, when I say when we felt the solar and wind options couldn't do that, there were hard, firm reasons for that. One of which was simple question of grid capacity. That a lot of the South African electrical grid was designed to transport energy from the north of the country to the south, from the coal fields of Mpumalanga into the urban heartlands. And running from the west, where there's the highest levels of solar radiation, to the east, there just simply wasn't any surplus grid capacity. So we saw early on that the easiest way out of load shedding would be a refitment of the country's coal fleet. This was a short-term solution. What refitment entails is going into the defunct coal plants, regardless of how old they are. Some of the oldest ones are the most solid. And doing an audit of their internal workings, the pipes, the gauges, the boilers, and all of that. Stripping out the parts that have failed or have reached the end of their useful lifespan. Ordering replacements from the original equipment manufacturers, or where these were not available, making the new parts and putting them back into operation. And a broad cross-section of people, some of it personal knowledge of Eskom plants, said to us, this will work. It's a 3-year exercise. If you do it inefficiently, you turn it into a 5-year exercise. And you can refit a third of the coal fleet. And by doing that, you will bring back into operation about we worked out about 11 to 12,000 megawatts of coal energy. Now, each 1,000 megawatts of production is one stage of load shedding. And so if you're at load shedding stage 3, you're short, you need to add 3,000 megawatts in theory to end load shedding. So we saw that coal was a shortcut to eliminate load shedding and enable a modest amount of future growth, because we've done the estimates on how much additional production needs to be added to the economy to enable what level of growth and job creation. The last piece of the puzzle was that Eskom had flirted for a time, and so had the cabinet, with the idea of decommissioning. And a marker or a flag of sorts we were looking for was signs that the government was reconsidering that strategy to decommission old coal plants, let them run down, replace them with something else. And that became increasingly evident since in the early stages of this year. The energy minister, Gwede Mantashe, had attracted a lot of flack in the press for saying a way out of load shedding is coal. And whatever his, we don't know that, whatever motives are assigned to him in the press, we don't have an opinion on those here. But he was correct on the facts of it. And when the new electricity minister was appointed, also ridiculed, why do we need an electricity minister, all of which is valid. But he was saying an important thing, that we should delay the decommissioning of coal and we should consider refitment. And we saw a clear shift in government policy. And that was enough for us to make the call in the face of a lot of opinion, which said that we were headed for much deeper stages of load shedding, that we anticipated load shedding being relieved. And we said that on this forum, we said that on other.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you. I just want to just clarify something here, just to draw it out what you're saying. Are you saying, I mean, everyone knows that a major part of what's going wrong with Eskom has been, and the corruption and the ongoing corruption, but you're saying there's another factor that's been at play here, and that has been the over-focus on alternative supplies of power other than coal?
That's very important. To be very clear, in our opinion, corruption was not the primary reason for load shedding. The primary reason for the depth of load shedding was a far too rapid exit from coal. And when that was reversed, and has now begun to be reversed, the load shedding levels have been much relieved. The corruption was a contributing factor, and a very important contributing factor, but it was not the primary factor behind load shedding, and therefore load shedding has been addressed, even though corruption in the state broadly and certainly around energy production still remains prevalent. So we made the call on that. We've subsequent to that published a detailed report that was shared with the government before it was published. It was shared with the leaders of political parties and the like as well for them to consider. And the criticism I'm sure we would attract is that we are dinosaurs, and we are investing in a old and toxic resource, and we are missing the boat on green energy, which should be the focus of the South African government. And our answer to that, we haven't actually faced this much because lights are on again. It's very hard to be critical of our advice to government. When the people really value the lights being on, we've realized it doesn't matter the cost. Our answer to that criticism would be, if we faced it, that it's a mistake to be dogmatic about South Africa's energy choices. It makes a great deal of sense to transition the South African economy out of coal, regardless of your stance on climate. Coal is a polluting, toxic a process that pumps all sorts of carcinogens and other toxic fumes into the air and does great damage to people and the environment. That's true. But South Africa has a second environment, which is one in which 50% of young people, more than that, do not have a job. And if that is not addressed very speedily, we run the risk of popular sentiment destabilizing the country's politics to a point that we risk the survival of our democracy. And if we lose the democracy, we become the kind of country that doesn't care about things like environmental concerns or air pollution. And that in our unique circumstances, and also given our history and through the apartheid era and preceding decades of colonial rule, it would be morally the correct choice to do what we can in the short term to again produce enough electricity to alleviate the enormous human suffering that arises from the very slow rates of growth that attach themselves to not having electricity. And also the point, which I've put to a few activists, that if you're a poor community in South Africa, you don't have electricity, you burn solid fuels in and around your home. And you're then inhaling the same kind of toxins and carcinogens and so on that coal would in any event produce. And our final advice to the South African government has been use the refitment of coal to buy the country the time to, while it transitions out of coal into a combination of nuclear and green. And the exact nature of that combination will be determined by the rate at which storage technology for green energy options improves and becomes cheaper. That's a real holdup on green at the moment, is you can produce a lot at peak times, but it's very difficult, very expensive to store enough to fuel your economy when the wind doesn't blow or during the night. As soon as those breakthroughs happen, and they surely will, then solar and wind options become much more attractive for South Africa. We're not dismissive of it now either. And on a small scale, households, small businesses and the like, there's a great deal that solar can do to alleviate load shedding, and it already is doing that. So our advice was, by the time, to address socioeconomic disasters, because to have a country where half young people don't have a job is a disaster and a moral crisis. Address that, and then in an ordered and planned basis, as those coal plants reach the end of their lives, which will be over the next 10 to 20 years, have the green and nuclear options in place to transition out of coal. And it is very encouraging that this is, to a great degree, what the South African government is trying to do. And it's an important story and a good one to start this evening with, because we all know and experience it. We live in communities where there's a very high degree of concern about whether South Africa can survive as an at all successful, free and open society. And these little progress we have made on load shedding, I think, is an important countervailing trend. Certainly, we're not out of the woods on load shedding either. And we could, before this winter is out, be in much deeper stages of load shedding again. That can happen. We're still at great risk. We've in fact done better in the short term than we anticipated we would. We thought it would take at least 9 months or so to get to the point that we've gotten to in 3 months. But the purpose of these conversations and what the Chief Rabbi put to me when he had this idea is let us try and cut through the angst and the uncertainty and the fear-mongering, and try and provide people who must now make decisions about their own lives in the country, their families, their kids, with high-quality, fact-based information that they can use to make rational decisions about their futures in South Africa. And the way this coal story is played out just in the first 3 months of this series, and the energy question has been a very good case study, I think, of the importance of doing exactly what the purpose of these talks are.
If I may just to just clarify what you're saying, and just to re-emphasize, and just to make sure that I understand 100%, you're in fact saying that the improvement in the load shedding schedule and the fact that it has come down in recent times is not a sort of a quirk of fate. This is actually as a direct result of a change in policy on the part of government to put more emphasis on the coal fleet. And that, in your view, the view of the SRF is the correct view for now in the country, and that it's not just didn't just happen. That this is the result of a change of direction, and that change of direction in a way is moving away from, say, the immediate ideology of the green movement, and saying, well, there's human suffering. Just to emphasize your point about the human suffering, in the meeting that I had with religious leaders and the president, at the beginning of the energy crisis, and I think I may have mentioned it on our first episode, the religious leaders said to the president, this is causing more suffering than COVID for South Africans on the ground. And it's not just that 50% unemployment rate of the youth, which of course is a very worrying number, but it is daily suffering. And so I think this this is not just a South African issue. This is kind of an emerging markets India is facing similar issues. And I think, isn't it time perhaps that the voice of kind of Africa and India and other places is heard in the kind of Western debate that's happening at the moment?
Yeah, I think the Indians have been very good on this, in telling Western democracies, listen here, you developed your economies through the use of fossil fuels. There's no dispute among South African policymakers, including those who've made the turn back to coal, and within in the Indian government, as far as I can tell, that it is desirable to transition over time to cleaner energy sources, regardless of one's views on climate. Coal is toxic and polluting. But that it is not right that the wealthy Western world forces emerging markets in Africa and Asia or elsewhere, South America, to endure longer and deeper periods of socioeconomic suffering and poverty than they should in order to meet short-term green goals and ambitions. And I think that's a perfectly defensible position and a very sound position. And I also, think that, to be discreet, there are Western diplomats here in this country who are beginning to appreciate that as well. And that's stampeding South Africa into technologies that will delay the emancipation of millions of people from a life of poverty and desperation is not a stance that the Western world can morally endure. And the stronger voices like those in India and those here about the energy choices of emerging markets become, I think the better it is to be encouraged. But the critical thing, to emphasize it again, there's not a dispute about transitions to green energy. The question is simply the pace at which emerging markets introduce those transitions. And in South Africa's case, if we get that right within 20 years, which we think is perfectly feasible, we in fact concluded that within 20 years, if we do what's currently being done just from an energy perspective, we can be a high growth emerging market, the economy of which will 2 decades from now be fueled almost entirely by clean energy sources. That's amazing in 20 years. But we've got to insist that we are given the time to do that transition in an ordered manner that doesn't compromise the living standards of poor people in South Africa or in India or anywhere else in the world where high levels of poverty and underdevelopment remain major political and social challenges.
Maybe that's like a good point to look at our next issue on the agenda tonight, and that of NHI, because I think there's perhaps a connection between the two, and that is the issue of ideology versus human suffering. In the case of NHI, there's a sort of an ideology which is driving it, and then there's the question about the reality. Maybe if you could just share your views, SRF views on the current NHI bill, and what does it say, and what are your concerns, and do you think this is a reality? Is this going to happen? And how do things look in this area? Because that's the other big concern. As I'm here, I'm really here to just give the voice to the questions I'm hearing in the community. And after load shedding and electricity, the next thing that people are talking about a lot is NHI.
Yeah, National Health Insurance, that's NHI. That's a policy proposal. It's been around in South Africa for the better part of 15 years. And the proposal is chiefly motivated by ideology, is to ensure that all people in South Africa have access to the same healthcare resources, an equitable division of resources. And for the original drafters of the policy, the motivation was that it is unfair that some people are able to make use of our absolutely brilliant world-class private healthcare system, while other people are forced to make use of the public system, which is often in poor state of repair and service isn't very good. The way that message has sometimes been interpreted in business is that NHI is there to ensure world-class standards of healthcare for all South Africans. Now, that's a strategic mistake, because that, I assure you, was not the motivation of the original crafters of this policy. And in business, sometimes the argument's been made, look, you can't really do this because there's not enough money to enable world-class access for all South Africans. The original drafters of the policy would say that doesn't worry us because we're not after that. We want to ensure the best quality of equal healthcare access to all South Africans within whatever limited resources are available. So even if it's not as good as what the private sector was, that's fine, as long as it's equitable and the same for everybody. If the proposal, as it's currently drafted in policy, is implemented and executed, what will ultimately happen is that the state will be the single point that purchases all healthcare services in the country. And it will, in the fullness of time, nationalize private medical schemes and incorporate their resources into a single pot of funds from which those healthcare products or services are made available. And regardless of who you are and where you find yourself in the country, you will be able to, in theory, visit any care provider, and that care provider will provide services to you free and will then claim back from the state. So that's the idea behind the policy. It's advanced very far over the past 15 years and has recently gotten through some, not final, but some very important parliamentary and sort of legislative process milestones. If the policy is implemented in the fullness of time, as it is currently drafted, it will cause immense damage to South Africa because the country will not be able to sustain its middle class, because if you can't sustain a middle class in the absence of world-class healthcare services, and the middle class will exit, and the capital and skills exit on the back of that, and the sentiment slump will do very great damage. You cannot underestimate the seriousness of this. You don't lightly use terms like failed states. You're thrown around too much on South Africa at the moment as it is, and we're not a failed state. But this would tempt such a definitional threshold. However, there are a few things to say to calm immediate fears. One is that the private medical industry is quite correct in stating, as it has done in its defense at length in the past month, that we are still far away from final implementation. That is true. We are a long way away, and we have a great deal of time before that happens. The second reason, and I don't like being hopeful, but the second strategic consideration is that if you assemble 400 politicians into a parliament and leave them unchecked to do what they do, in Brussels, you've got thousands of lawyers and accountants crammed into a few city blocks, and they sit there regulating Europe, which is why Europe got as far as regulating the curvature of a banana, because that was what they do. If you leave lawmakers, policymakers, and politicians to make laws and policies, and you don't challenge them, the process gets a momentum all of its own. And I think to an extent that is what has happened with national health insurance. And it's got as far as it's gotten because it hasn't faced serious and coordinated resistance, not for its own sake, but to create the pressure to slow the policy process and then develop very compelling alternatives, which the private medical industry has in abundance, such as a low-fee medical aid scheme. It's just one, and partnerships with the public sector to increase quality of services, and a whole host of things, to move the policy process off the current destructive track onto a track that will see South Africa maintain its standing as a provider of world-class private healthcare. And that is the anchor that a lot of the fixed investment and capital resources and skills resources in the country depends on. We can retain that and use that at the same time to aid the state in improving the quality of healthcare systems broadly. Now, if you want to do this, you need to understand something about the ANC, which has always been true of it, certainly through its sort of modern age, which dates to the aftermath of the Second World War. If you want to get somewhere with the ANC, you need to develop a relationship where it understands that you are prepared to take a stand in defense of interests or policies or ideas or principles that are important to you. If you indulge its worst instincts or seek to go along with it, to get along with it, as the mining industry did here for 20 years, or seek to appease it, or seek to be nice to it in the face of policies that will clearly do damage, you tempt a situation where it cannot help but to bully you further and move further and further down that policy track. If, on the other hand, you take a firm, well-argued, well-resourced position to say that this policy is so at odds with our best interests and those of the country that we are prepared to oppose it firmly, the ANC will initially probe your sincerity, will test you, see if you're going to back down, perhaps threaten something or becomes a bit cross. If it sees that you are prepared to stand your ground and that you have broad backing around you to do that, it will change and it will begin to negotiate. And the reason for this is not guesswork or happenstance or any of those things. But deep within the makeup of the ANC is a very sound understanding of revolutionary ideology, which business leaders and relative elites and many political leaders in the Western world no longer have, because the Cold War ended 30 years ago and they've forgotten. And what that revolutionary ideology says, and it's quite true, is you can advance the revolution against the private healthcare sector in this case if you meet with no resistance. But as soon as resistance is encountered, you must stop. And if the resistance is sincere, you must even reverse your position to lull your opponent into a false sense of security. And the reason is the nature of the revolution for the ANC is not one of nationalizing the means of production and the state taking over. The South African state would never entertain going mining in its own right, as many empty mines are sort of lay about the place. Its objective rather is to harness the private sector and its resources to the revolutionary agenda of the state, to slowly and incrementally apply those resources, often under the management still of the private sector initially. And if you frighten the horses and inadvertently build up a body of resistance to your revolutionary ambition, that is no longer possible. And precedent for this is widespread. I worked for 2 years on a project to stop expropriation without compensation. And that followed the aggressive adoption of that idea in 2018. And that project was very successful in that it killed the explicit notion, stone dead, within 2 years by following this kind of strategy. There are still risks on expropriation, serious ones. There's a dangerous piece of expropriation legislation. But speaking with actually a surprising amount of experience of doing this over time. This is a strategy that works every time. And
can I just, sorry, no, go ahead. Sorry, finish that point, yeah.
If this nature of strategy, it's not a hostile strategy, it's not aggressive, you don't call the government a bunch of delinquents. You merely understand that all political activity is about forcing a balance of power. And if you can force a balance of power around the question of NHI now and build up a public opposition and resistance, you will stop the process and reverse it. And once you've reversed it sufficiently, you can actually introduce a new positive process that brings about much better healthcare access to all South Africans while maintaining the excellence of the private sector. And this is virtually assured. And when you do that, I mean, my experience over the years was often that there were leaders within the South African government who were grateful that this had happened. Because the ANC is not the kind of organization that likes tall poppies. You don't stand up at an executive meeting in the face of the manifestation of the will of the party and say, well, I, as the individual, I think this is nuts. But when an outside force comes in and forces you to a standstill, there are many serious and pragmatic individuals in and around the ANC and the present government who would be grateful to use that opposition as an excuse to stop the dangerous drift of this policy and supplant it with something more constructive.
I think that the point that I wanted just to mention in this context, we were talking about the moral issue of NHI, and of course there is an imperative that every human being is entitled to proper health care at the highest possible levels. But what was so interesting, I saw in the main editorial of the City Press on Sunday, was this notion that actually, everyone agrees with the objective, but this is not the method to achieve it, because ultimately the reason for the failure of healthcare in the public sector is not because of lack of resource. It's a budget which I think by international standards is a very high percentage of the budget, and there's enough money inside government healthcare to ensure world-class service delivery. That is not the problem. The problem is in the implementation and the execution of it. So exactly how would this solve the problem of the suffering on the ground? That's why I think this issue of it's human suffering versus ideology, because I heard that the private medical aids had put forward a proposal to government to say that for between a mere 150 to 300 rand a month, they would provide health insurance to every South African that would give them access to private health care. And that was rejected by the government, to the point where now the private health insurance industry is actually taking the government on review on this matter. But I mean, is that not the absurdity of it, that this is not about the morality of helping poor people with proper health care, because there are many solutions to that. And actually the outline of the solution is to use the brilliant private health care and make that accessible to more and more South Africans. And here was a perfect opportunity to do that, and the government turned it down.
No, you're right. What we spend on health as a share of GDP, we should have far better outcomes. If you doubt or ask why would the state do this, and you doubt my explanation of ideology and my secondary explanation of looting the resources within private medical schemes. So as the South African state started to run out of money, as the deficit grew after 2008, we did see signs of a pivot away from looting public resources to looking into the deep pools of private capital that exist and seeing whether these could be applied. As I say, applied, not applied to the revolutionary agenda of the state as a precursor to their eventual nationalization. So those are the primary. If you challenge that and say, well, you don't think it's ideological, you don't think it's looting, you think it's a sincere attempt at improving healthcare services. If that were so, walk into a typical government hospital or clinic or read the horror stories. A government that deeply cared about the standards of healthcare its people receive would not be administering hundreds of facilities that are as truly awful as much of South Africa's public healthcare infrastructure. You're right on low-fee medical aid schemes. These are a wonderful innovation, but they, for technical reasons, I don't think we should go into tonight. It is not possible at this stage for an insurer to provide cheap, low-fee medical aid to an individual who wished to purchase that at this level of, I don't know what the entry point is. I think it's about 250, 300 rand a month. So that's very possible. And the upshot therefore for me on NHI is it is as dangerous in the fullness of time as it's described. But at this time, we have more than enough time to build up the body of constructive opposition to ensure that the policy is not implemented as drafted, but is replaced instead by something very much more pragmatic. And it is encouraging. It's again encouraging. I think you referred to an editorial piece in City Press this past weekend, very critical. We've seen that in other parts of the media. We've seen various civil society and civil rights groups saying they will oppose this in public, overseas, in the courts. We've seen groups of medical specialists. One I paid particular attention to was in Natal, saying we're not going to accept this because this threatens our livelihoods and futures. You've seen healthcare policy people say one of the great dangers in this is that even if the government doesn't do it in the 5 or 10 years ahead of the point where it might do it, you will do such damage to investment in private healthcare and to South Africa's ability to retain already a problem, the healthcare professionals we train, that quite frankly, by the point you decide to do this or not to do it, a lot of the damage will already be baked into the South African equation. So the resistance to that is building very successfully. And if it continues to build, my expectation is, and it wins the support of the industry broadly, my expectation is that in that case, it will be seen off. But if that resistance collapses or is undermined or was a sort of flash in the pan and dies away, then the question of NHI does remain a sort of existential risk to South Africa's survival as a free and open society.
But your assessment looking at sort of the media, I think even organized business, BUSA and others, as civil society, all of the current noise and trends within the opposition, which is just beginning, does that sort of indicate that this opposition will eventually reach the critical mass that will defeat this, in your opinion? You
must do exactly that with analysts, what you're doing with me. Say, get off the fence and make a call. And 3 months ago, I told you load shedding would lessen, and it did. On NHI, I expect that the body of resistance will continue to build. And in that event, I expect that we will see off this threat over the next 3 to 4 years and eliminate the threat and replace it with a much more constructive body of healthcare policy. There's the call.
Yeah, but I think, thank you for making the call. But I think it's also a call to action for all members of civil society and business to step into this, and I think that it's actually in the interests of every South African. This is not about class warfare. This is actually in the interest of protecting against human suffering on vast scale here. Perhaps don't say what can I do? I'm just a little guy. What can I do? You can do a lot. You can write a letter to your chief rabbi. If the chief rabbi gets enough of those letters, he gets a mandate.
and you put pressure, he acts on this in your interests to an extreme degree, I assure you. It allows him to just to stay with him. He's here, so it makes sense. Allows him to build up a body of support in the broader religious community. You can write your medical aid scheme and say, listen, you've invested in the scheme. It's now at risk because it is. What is your plan to oppose it? You can join and support the broad cross-section of civil rights groups that are gearing up and some are already far advanced in their opposition to this. And that is the difference. If large numbers of individuals learn how to use the agency they have, even in small ways, to oppose counterproductive policy, if you have a position of any influence in your community or in your business, do the same. It is that kind of action. I remember once we had a campaign on something like this, and a chap said to us, all I can do is give you 20 Rand a month, and the system we used could do that. And he said he's very sorry, but he doesn't have much money. And I actually remarked to my colleagues, I said, that guy who's gone to this length to reach out to you, actually do the 20 Rand, he does more to safeguard the future of the country than very wealthy people who sit on their asses and do nothing about it because they're scared of the political implications. And you as the individual have multiplied by thousands of people around you, have vast agency to help set a constructive agenda for the country, and you must never forget that.
Okay, great. It's an important message. Just if we move on just to this issue, just changing tracks completely. I mean, I'm just sort of mentioning all the things of concern that I've been hearing, at different community events, people writing to me. The other big one, of course, is this whole story with Russia and the South African government's almost not alliance, but certainly support of, I don't know how one determined, but sort of the relationship with Russia that puts South Africa out of kilter with many governments and certainly Western governments, and the concern for that and potential, sanctions. Could South Africa actually be the subject of sanctions from the United States?
Yeah. Okay. Let's South Africa is supportive of Russia. That's what it is. And that puts it at odds with much of Western Europe and North America. This is the position we're in at the moment. I don't think that Western liberal democracies can or should dictate South Africa's foreign policy. I think South Africa is best advised to adopt a foreign policy, again, similar to that to India. We spoke about India earlier on energy. India doesn't say a great deal about what's happening in the Ukraine. India profits handsomely from trade with Russia and uses its extremely important position on the Indian Ocean Rim to extract trade and diplomatic and other advantages from the world's Western democracies. So it's a policy of national interest. I think given the complexity of the conflict, that perhaps not going to get into this evening, the historical ties between South Africa's liberation movement government and Russia, and the present ties between that party and Russia and China. A successful resolution here would be to see South Africa adopt a much more intelligent foreign policy. It can maintain its relations with Russia as it chooses to, but it cannot do so at the expense of its relationships with Western democracies. And that's what's beginning to happen, and that's the danger and the risk for us. My experience is that there are people in the ANC, senior people, and in the government who deeply regret this. There are a number, I've counted several now, delegations of ANC and government leaders who have been dispatched around North America and Western Europe to try and clarify South Africa's position. They are often incompetent in how they do so. Our ambassadors in foreign capitals are often deeply incompetent and unable to articulate South Africa's national interest. But the idea that the ANC has a cavalier approach to our relationships with Western democracies is not what my experience of the past 3 or 4 months has been. My experience is that there is a deep sympathy for Russia and its position vis NATO, but also a sincere desire to maintain the trade and related advantages it draws from Western democracies. And I think that is a conflict of interest that a wise and intelligent government could pull off. A reason for that is that South Africa is strategically very important now to the Western world. There is no serious, at this time, threat of sanctions against South Africa that I'm aware of, and I'm fairly well briefed on these things. Even on the question of AGOA, which is a trade preference scheme that we have with the United States and that a fraction of our trade with the US moves through, there is, as I read it, an attempt within the US administration to renew AGOA. Now, why would Western democracies not just kick us to the curb and say, bunch of deplorables, good luck with China and Russia? The reason is that we sit on the Indian Ocean rim, which with India and much of Africa's east coast and access to the Suez Canal makes us strategically important. We also sit on the South Atlantic. Now, the South Atlantic is arguably even more important and is becoming, people are starting to realize it is, some of the most important and valuable geostrategic real estate in the world. China will likely back Argentina's claim to the Falkland Islands, and in exchange, perhaps get some sort of naval facility that guards the Drake Strait, which is the shipping passage off South America. China may also likely was advanced in acquiring a naval facility at the port of Bata in Equatorial Guinea. Sailing from Bata, the Chinese Navy is closer to New York than if it had a base in Hawaii, and it guards the southern access to the South Atlantic. The third access point to the South Atlantic are the ports at Simonstown or Walvis Bay in Namibia. And if those ports fall to China or Russia, Western access to the South Atlantic is compromised. If something happens in the Suez or Panama canals that obstructs them, all global bulk shipping moves in a band between the 50th and 60th parallel south through the Drake Strait or around the coast of southern Africa, where ice further south makes the passage rather narrow. For a second reason why Western countries have to be careful in how they approach South Africa now is resources and critical minerals. The French are being forced out of West Africa by the Russians. And North Africa has lost too much of the Western world as it is. The East is being contested. China now has a very advanced naval facility, has had for some time, that guards the Suez Canal off Djibouti. It neighbors one of the Americans. Southern Africa is now up for grabs. If the Western world loses its regional influence in Southern Africa, it loses a great deal. One resource is critical minerals, the kinds of things that are necessary to build smart chips and cell phones and the like. Take platinum group metals, for example. If you want access to that, you can deal with Zimbabwe, you can deal with Russia, you can deal with South Africa. Those are the major resources. The Western world loses access to such mineral resources, its ability to stay competitive with China, particularly, and Russia in very much a secondary way, is much reduced, and policymakers are aware of that. Africa is now home to more cities of 1 million people than Europe and America combined. It's urbanizing quickly and income levels are rising, meaning that in an era of anticipated global slowdown, Africa presents the world's last great untapped consumer market. If you are exited from Africa ahead of that, your firms, your manufacturing, your products cannot benefit from that. And Africa is home to over 50 votes on global fora, such as the United Nations. You don't just walk away from that, because it means that you're going to lose a progressive number of majorities of votes on critical issues on the world's major global fora. So I think the position for the Western world and South Africa is far more finely balanced than some of the analysis that's come out of business or come out of the South African media has suggested over the past several weeks, as our dalliance and flirtations with Russia has risen. And the upshot of that, why it's important to you, is I don't think Western capitals are going to turn their backs on South Africa and our trade relations at this point to any significant extent. They'll posture, maybe to placate opposition back home, they'll threaten many punishments, you think of them that way. But if they took truly firm action against South Africa, banned and go, for example, introduce sanctions, the effect will simply be to drive South Africa and Southern Africa deeper into the orbit of Russia and China. And strategically, from a national security perspective, that makes no sense for Western Europe or North America. So I don't think it's going to happen. And I think what will in practice happen is South Africa is going to have its way on its relationships with Russia or whoever else to a far greater extent than has been the case to date. I think that will be balanced by a greater awareness on the part of South Africa of the kind of trouble that you create for yourself when you engage in activities that are seen as wholly unacceptable to the sensitivities of Western liberal democracies, such as some of our military flirtations with Russia have been of late. And I think you'll see on the South African side a tempering down of that. And on the Western side, I think you'll see a similar attempt at finding each other again. So I don't share the view that our Russian relationship is going to, in the short term, trigger an economic crisis or catastrophe or currency catastrophe for the country.
Yeah, but I hear you saying, in terms of that, it's not a question of the sort of moral issue of this, because I think, and I mean that wasn't my question. It was really around this question of the sanctions, which is top of mind of what people are really concerned about. Because if there's sanctions, what will that do to already struggling economy, etc. So. But I think just talking as a religious leader, the sort of supporting places like Russia and China and Iran, which are all autocracies, they're tyrannies. There's, I just a few days ago wrote a letter to President Ramaphosa about the Wall Street Journal journalist who is imprisoned at the moment, and asking him to intercede on his behalf. But it's just a symbol of countries that perpetuate human rights abuses on a daily basis. There is no chance of a fair trial. There is no freedom of the press, no freedom of association, no human rights. I mean, all the issues that actually the ANC was asking the American and Western Europe to sanction apartheid South Africa for, the human rights abuses of apartheid, which were grievous and evil, and yet China, Russia, Iran are guilty of the same kind of human rights abuses. So I think it's disappointing from that point of view. But you actually, what you're saying is, from a kind of pure sort of realpolitik, they're going to get away with it, however kind of morally repugnant it may be.
Yeah, I think that's my position. That from We said we strip hope and fear and so on out of these briefings and events from a hard policy and economic perspective, and aware of what that means in the living standards of ordinary people. I think that the ANC will ultimately have its head here on South Africa's foreign policy. I also think the war in Europe is coming to an end. The great Ukrainian push that's in progress is probably the final one. If it fails, which I think it will fail, Western defense chiefs will tell their politicians that there's no more that we can do. And what will then happen, I expect, is that the Ukrainian and Russian forces will dig into their current positions, and the intensity of the war will be greatly reduced. A stalemate of sorts will play out over the next year. And I anticipate further that the timing works quite good, and early in 2025, Western governments will tell their people, we've done all we can. We've secured the bulk of Ukraine from what they will describe as Russian aggression. Russia will be able to tell itself and Russians that we have secured the east of Ukraine and the future for ethnic Russians from what it would describe as Ukrainian aggression. And a ceasefire will be negotiated. And the reason why I'm confident on this is varied. One is what you're told is going to happen by the people who will make it happen, some of them, not all of them. But the Russian-Ukrainian forces are currently digging in to lines that approximate quite closely those of the Minsk agreements of just more than a decade ago, which were an early effort to prevent this kind of conflict by it wasn't quite formal, but in a sense, for the purpose of this evening, partitioning Ukraine in a manner that the eastern regions had a degree of autonomy, although they would still fall under the ultimate authority of Kiev. That will change now. They'll fall under the ultimate authority of Russia. But as this war ends over the next 18 months, the capacity for it to be used as a conflict touch point between South Africa and its Western allies will dissipate at the same rate. And I think I'm right on that. And if I am, we escape with less damage economically than might otherwise have been the case.
Okay, great. So you're making lots of calls here tonight based on the analysis of the SRF. The final part of our conversation, I suppose would really be in that, because the other thing that people are concerned about is the elections, 2024 elections, which are just about a year away. I think some of the feedback that I got after our first conversation in episode 1 was, this big fear of an ANC EFF alliance in that election, and where that would where that would take the country. So that's the feedback I received from our last conversation, and I'm just here to share the questions and things that are bothering our community. So what's your take on that fear, and how are these elections in 2024 looking?
Yeah, we're far away from that still. We're a year out from or just less than that, out from the 2024 election. The most recent data continues to suggest that the ANC is flirting with the 50% figure. So my call is that if an election were held today, the ANC on its own would be just over 50%. A few people who hear that say, well, that surprises them with load shedding and all the rest. One of my answers to that is, when I started my career, they were at 70. And being at 50 is a hell of a steep fall. In urban areas, the ANC is polling at only 30%, so it's lost the urban aspirant middle class perhaps permanently. And its 50% is essentially a function of an aging rural demographic that keeps it in power. But that demographic will erode over time at a combination of the country's mortality and urbanization rates. So that's not enough to keep the ANC in power. So in the fullness of time, ANC loses an election. It's just may not be the next election. Even if the ANC is slightly below 50%, it's got enough friends and allies and proxies that it can call upon, short of the EFF, to get itself back over the 50% level again. Even if it makes the deal with the EFF, it's a very risky moment that, if handled incorrectly, could send the country into failed state status. That's true. However, for that to happen, the ANC and EFF, in their 5 years together in partnership ahead of the next election, would need to ensure that we never reach the next election. Because if we did, the consequences just of the sentiment shift on South Africa following that alliance, given the mad policy proposals of the EFF and its ANC and its allies in the ANC, which isn't the whole of the ANC, would be sufficient to so depress living standards in South Africa, a relationship we understand very well, how living standards inform voter behavior, that over that 5-year interval, exacerbated by the aging rural demographic, combined ANC-EFF support should fall to well below 50%, and they are both removed in the election of 2029. It is more likely, stripping hope and fear out of it, that happens, they collectively lose in 29, than that they prevail to destroy the country's democracy and we don't go to another election, we become a failed state. And the reason for that is that what they have to do to achieve that is they have to erode the constitutional edifice, freedom of speech, the rule of law, property rights, fiscal prudence. It's a long list of very difficult objectives, made more difficult by the fact that South Africa has a battle-hardened and experienced civil society sector, which has proven very good at defeating, and in part, the war isn't won, these are battles, the worst of state capture, the threat of expropriation, and a whole host of other things. And if you just asked me on the cold sort of rationality of it, ANC-EFF versus the Constitution, backed up by South Africa's civil society, I'd say if that civil society is well-resourced, it will win in the end. So even an ANC-EFF deal, I think, is survivable. Difficult, but survivable. The prospect of the broader opposition winning an election and pushing the ANC and EFF together to below 50 at this time isn't good, because that opposition finds itself in conflict with itself to a far too great an extent to inculcate the reasonable expectation in the minds of voters that it can govern the country successfully. There are some exciting new opposition options that are emerging. They may begin to help to change that. But at this time, no, it doesn't look like the broader opposition can win. Outside of 3 provinces, the Western Cape, firmly in opposition hands, but watch that one closely. 19% of the population of the Western Cape is white, 50% is colored, 30% is black. It will be very difficult for the DA to hold the Western Cape if the colored vote in the Western Cape splits. Now, the colored vote is always split between the ANC and the DA in the Cape. But we now have newcomers, such as Gayton McKenzie, who I think people look at and consider his history and so time in prison and so on, and write him off. And that's a mistake, because I think he's a very capable, potentially very capable political operator and actor. So watch what happens in the Western Cape. In Natal, we see the ANC falling far below 50%, and we see a clear surge for the IFP, borne out by some by-election results, the recent ones, which were stunning for the IFP. Also see Mackenzie, by the way, in coloured communities in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, securing stunning results for his PA party against the DA. Third one to watch is Gauteng. ANC well below 50 again. The question there is, does the ANC and the EFF collectively have a majority in Gauteng? That changes from poll to poll. It's on a knife edge. If they don't, and the broader opposition can keep the collective out of power in Gauteng, they can, collective ANC, EFF, they could probably keep them, they could more likely keep them out of power at a national level as well. So that Gauteng battleground becomes very important. When we meet again, or whenever that's scheduled, if it's, I will have updated numbers for you on what's happening in the Western Cape. We'll also, before the end of the year, have updated numbers on KZN, so we know exactly what's happening in those two provinces. We're also going to test the national picture on South Africa again, so we can update the exact standing of the parties for you before the end of the year.
So you're saying in short, firstly, that if the election were held today, in essence, you're saying most likely outcome, in your opinion, national would be ANC, but not with the EFF. They would kind of squeak in with
the national with the ANC. Now, my election today, ANC wins 51, 52, 53%. That is not the worst result. I hear a lot of let's throw the ANC out of power and terrible people, banish them to the political wilderness. You can understand the sentiment behind that. Many people in the ANC feel that way too. But be careful. Do not wish for the ANC's demise before you know exactly what's going to replace it. Don't roll that dice. The reason for that is serious, that we may have one shot as a free and open democratic society to transition from the post-94 government to a new one. If the coalition in government is chaotic and shambolic and disappoints people, that may be more than a disappointment just in the coalition, but may increase or raise to a dangerous extent doubts in the merits of democracy itself. And if that happens, we open the door to radical populism. It's a safer position to have the ANC in power for 5 years and allow the opposition to organize themselves properly, I'd argue for you, than it is to throw the ANC out of power, even if one had the power to do that, and gamble on whatever is going to take its place. Because the amount of conflict and infighting in the opposition ranks now is such that I do not have confidence that they could successfully handle the task of governing the country. Now, there's a year to go. That can be fixed and addressed, so it's a long way out. But at this time, that is the most likely result.
Yeah, so you're saying national ANC sort of squeaks in, and the chances are that Gauteng, Western Cape, and KZN are governed then by the coalition of the current opposition parties. The three biggest provinces from an economic point of view would then be in opposition hands, and then you're saying that this would lay the platform, for a 2029 victory then potentially for opposition parties.
Yeah, there are a lot of complex results now, new ones that are emerging given some of the later numbers. If the ANC is below 50 nationally and below 50 in Natal, to make a deal with Inkatha. So to Inkatha, you get free rein to govern Natal. You do a confidence and support agreement with us, which is a confidence and support agreement is an important concept for South Africans to begin to understand. You don't have to go into alliance with another party to put it in government as a coalition. Confidence and support agreement is a halfway point where you say you will oppose any motions of no confidence in the ANC's government, just for the sake of stability, and you will support it in getting the budget through so that the country can be governed. So let's say ANC below 50 nationally, and in Natal, you give Natal to the IFP, and the IFP puts the ANC back in at a national level. Let's say ANC below 50 nationally, just below 50, and below in KZN and Gauteng. A similar kind of deal can be. I'm just using the example of Inkatha this evening. It's not that it will necessarily happen. Inkatha and some smaller proxies put the ANC back into power in Gauteng and back into power at a national level. The real kind of shake-up happens if Gayton McKenzie takes the DA to below 50% in the Western Cape. Then the DA needs the Freedom Front to form a government in the Western Cape, failing which McKenzie and the ANC can get into power in the Western Cape. And then that just changes the outlook completely for the country, and do similar deals around national government with other ANC proxy or smaller parties that lean ANC, and do the same in Gauteng. The point of you're not meant to follow all of that because it's complex. The point I'm making is that there are a myriad of options at this time, and they're going to be, the number of options is going to increase over the next over the period until the election next year. And the short of an ANC majority, it's not infinite, but there are going to be a wide range of mathematical formulations that can put a government into power. And a point that we've made as SRF to some of the politicians are the people that govern the future South Africa and its provinces aren't necessarily going to be the biggest parties. They're going to be the best deal makers. And political deal making and building alliances around deals is going to be one of the key skills that determines whether you're in government, whether you're not.
And when you say deal making, I mean, this is, I suppose coalition, or let's say proportional representation systems. That's really what it looks like. I mean, we need to look no further than, say, Israel, for example. It's cobbling together coalitions at every level.
Yeah, why did Netanyahu win? Because he built better and more creative deals on the right than his opponents could on the left. Same reasoning and rules are going to apply here evermore.
But between now and the elections, this is all if the elections were held today, are there any sort of X factors that could happen that would throw the thing up?
How does the ANC lose terribly? These things happen. Mr. Ramaphosa goes. His national popularity is way down, but he's strongly popular amongst ANC voters. Load shedding gets a lot worse ahead of the election. Gets truly terrible. And the broader opposition, the third factor, work together really efficiently. If those three things happen, the broader coalition is working together brilliantly, wherever it governs, no more squabbling. And Mr. Ramaphosa is gone, and load shedding is at stage a lot. ANC can lose the election by a landslide, opposition come to power. But at this time, the broader coalition are squabbling, load shedding is diminishing, and Mr. Ramaphosa is going to stick around for the election. These are all factors that, just think when we last spoke, many people viewing this were very pessimistic on load shedding. It's now better. 3 months' time when we speak, some of these factors will have rearranged themselves again. And they'll do so again and again before we get to the election. So there are no firm certainties here, but on current trends, the ANC, with the support of smaller parties if needed, will govern South Africa for the 5 years to 2029.
Yes, and opposition in the three big provinces, and most likely, and then this is entering in now the new era of the country, which is essentially coalition governments.
That's right. Yeah, 400 years. I don't know if we said this last time. 400 years of history in the territory that's modern South Africa. Always one major player, or predominantly one major player, political player, has had the ability to force policies that had to be acceded to by the country's inhabitants, even before it was a country. Just think of the territory. That's changing now. And if we remain a free society, otherwise, if we head off the threat of the ANC-EFF destroying the constitutional edifice, we'll never be in that position again. And way out into let's go a decade out into the future, Our biggest political parties are going to have just over a third of the vote, likely a kind of national Africanist rural party. Our second biggest political party might have around a quarter of the vote, and that's going to be a very cosmopolitan, urban, kind of mobile, younger, middle-class party. So that gives us, let's say, 35 and 25, that gives us 60. About 10, 15% are going to be the radical Marxist left. And everything in the middle of that is going to be carved up by smaller political parties with 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% of the vote, often quite far to the right, and often with an ethnic nationalist kind of a political base. And what I've described to you, if you're familiar with Israeli politics, not far off the kind of structure of the Knesset. And if you're familiar with German politics, it's not far off the structure of the Bundestag. And this is our natural political evolution. It's likely to continue. And in such a structure, it's the deal makers that govern. And the same rules are going to most likely apply here as well.
Hey, Frans, I want to just thank you for all the time that you've given today. And I think, it's so important for us to continue these conversations every few weeks or months, just to touch base, get a rational perspective on what's going on. And I think it's important to speak out all of the concerns. That's what I've been trying to do this evening, share the concerns of where the community is. And I'm so grateful to you and our community is for the work that you're doing and the work that the SRF is doing to bring, rational context to things that are happening in South Africa.
Well, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to talk to you this evening, and I look forward to the next one. Thank you.
Yes, looking forward. Keep well, and thank you to everybody for joining us, and we hope to keep these conversations coming. May Hashem bless us all. I mean, ultimately, we're wherever a human being is in the world, we're in God's hands, and we as human beings, as Jews, member of the Jewish community, we continue to daven, which we do for ourselves, for our community, for our country, for the world. That's really part of our hopes and our prayers for one another and for all of humanity as we go on these journeys together. So thank you so much for joining us.